Imagine, in the pre-dawn cold of December 17, 1944, a line of German tanks stalled on a muddy Ardennes track. Men climbed down, boots sinking in frozen slush, faces lit by tracer and torchlight. One crewman lifts the lid of a Tiger's fuel tank and finds it nearly empty. The gauge sticks at the bottom. A few hundred yards away, under a wavering floodlight, American soldiers are stacking jerry cans into a pyramid so vast it looks like improvised architecture. Row upon row of metal canisters, glinting like a strange, dirty monument. The sight should be salvation for any armored force. Instead, it lands like a verdict. Why could Allied logistics, the convoys, pipelines, and air supply that moved tons of material across continents, render 300-mile-per-hour German fighters and fearsome armored machines tactically irrelevant? Why did a mountain of fuel, tanks that once roared like beasts, and even the terror of German fighters fail to translate into an operational advantage? The answer begins not with the speed of an aircraft or the armor of a tank, but with who controlled the raw flow of fuel and how willing one side was to burn its own stores rather than let them be taken. If this is grabbing you, stay with the full explanation. And if you like deep dives into the mechanics of modern warfare, consider subscribing for more. December 17th, Hansfeld. The column had been pushing deeper into the Ardennes under orders and hope. Snow spit at the men. The attack surprised Allied lines at first. Concentration and audacity forced momentary gaps. A German spearhead reached the village of Hansfeld and, in the confusion of movement and counter-movement, stumbled into something few expected, a capture of a forward American supply node. The discovery was not a neat victory, it was a revelation. Soldiers and junior officers moved among the stacks, rifling through packages, turning over crates stamped with supply symbols, finding manifests, ration lists, and the thing that stopped many men in their tracks, the ubiquitous jerry can. It was everywhere, filled, sealed, labeled, and ready to flow into engines, pumps, and radiators. Men passed fuel from can to tank in a frenetic, almost reverent rhythm. Journal entries from the field later described the smell, sharp, oily, alive, the black smoke curling from a hastily improvised refueler, the metallic clink of cans. For German crews used to calculate its scarcity, the sight had the absurd quality of abundance. One regimental commander, later identified in some accounts as Piper in contemporary transcripts, is not verifiable by name in surviving official records. In scripting this scene, we will refer to him as the regimental commander, name indefinito, whose reaction, stunned, officious, helpless, captures the broader confusion. This was less a windfall than proof of a broader truth.
That truth can be stated bluntly. By late 1944, Germany simply did not have the petroleum base to fuel a modern mechanized army at the scale demanded by a major offensive. The Germans had built their war machine in part on synthetic chemistry, coal into liquid fuel. But by the autumn campaigns, Allied bombing, interdiction of rail, and loss of occupied resources began to erode that capacity. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, acknowledged after the war that shortages of fuel became a decisive constraint. Speer's memoirs and post-war analyses do not pretend a single policy error caused the collapse. Rather, they record an accumulation of restraints, refinery damage, loss of access to oil fields, and transportation bottlenecks. Whatever numbers one uses, the trend is clear. German fuel production and reserves in late 1944 were measured in days and weeks for front units, not in the months or strategic cushions that the Allies enjoyed. The contrast with Allied logistical capacity could not be more striking. Where German armored divisions calculated their progress based on every gallon conserved, Allied planners had, by the fall of 1944, converted American industrial output into operational mobility on an unprecedented scale. The transformation had several pillars: the Red Ball Express, a network of provisional and later more permanent pipelines from the Channel across liberated territory, airlift when necessary, and a culture of logistics that treated fuel as central to strategy rather than an afterthought. The Red Ball Express is often used as shorthand for American logistical muscle. Organized in August 1944 to keep Allied armies supplied during the rapid post-Normandy advance, it deployed thousands of trucks and drivers in a continuous loop from supply depots in the Channel ports into the continent. At its peak, the operation relied on several thousand dedicated vehicles and many thousands of drivers, moving food, ammunition, vehicle parts, and, crucially, fuel in quantities that dwarfed what a comparable German supply train could displace under similar conditions. The exact daily tally shifted with the front, weather, and port capacity. Historians' reconstructions of the period place Allied daily fuel movements in Northwest Europe during peak months in the hundreds of thousands to low millions of gallons per day range. Those numbers were imperfect, varied by season, and demanded constant maintenance. Still, the key point is scale. Allied supply columns were operating at a scale and tempo that allowed commanders to think in terms of mobility rather than deprivation. Pipelines played an equally strategic role. Pluto, the project to lay underwater pipelines across the channel, has the romance of its name, but the practicality of its function.
At first, fuel for the invasion was shuttled ashore by tanker and then by jerrycan. PLU-2 and subsequent inland pipeline networks gradually converted a logistical headache into a relatively stable, high-volume flow. By late 1944 and into 1945, pipelines and inland distribution reduced reliance on vulnerable truck convoys for core fuel deliveries, allowing the Allies to sustain armor and air operations without exposing every gallon to interdiction. Air transport also featured in the metaphor the Germans later found humiliating, the notion of flying furniture. This phrase, of course, is metaphorical. It captures a shift, not that cargo planes literally carry couches over the front in any strategic sense, but that aviation and transport aircraft were being used to lift material, often in modular, stowable crates, into the theater at a tempo that made static defenses or localized interdiction ineffective. Glider and transport operations had been decisive in earlier airborne operations, but in the later months of 1944, the combination of airlift, pipelines, and truck convoys meant that the Allies could project sustained material advantage over distances German logistics simply could not match. Numbers matter because numbers create operational effects. Consider the arithmetic in stark terms without attempting to pretend precision where sources conflict. If an Allied Army Corps required conservatively tens of thousands of gallons per day to sustain its vehicles and aircraft, then sustaining several corps, as the Western Allied armies did, required daily flows measured in the hundreds of thousands to millions of gallons. Germany, stripped of access to the Caucasus oil fields and under sustained Allied strategic bombing focused on fuel and transportation targets, could not match that replenishment rate. The result was not just a fuel shortage, it was a change in operational posture. Where German plans once assumed gas would be delivered to forward units in something close to real time, commanders now had to ration, prioritize, and in some operations, cannibalize tanks to keep a single spearhead moving. The practical consequence appears in the field in many ways. Lanes clogged with vehicles, field trucks, and supply trains moving at a crawl became targets for air attack, artillery, and simple breakdown. Narrow Ardennes roads, hemmed by the forest and badly maintained under cold and snow, turned to funnels where the logistical advantages of mass were also liabilities. Long columns burned time and fuel simply idling. An Allied platoon able to hold a choke point could delay an entire armored column by hours. Each hour of delay consumed precious diesel that could not be replaced from the back. Allied doctrine prioritized keeping the wheels turning. German doctrine of 1940s battlefield maneuver assumed a more stable supply base.
Back in Hansfeld, the captured manifest and stamps were telling not merely as proof of Allied organization, but as a demonstration of systems thinking. The stacks of jerrycans bore the supply chain's fingerprints, destination inks, depot stamps, and routing numbers. Those small bureaucratic marks, mundane in peacetime, read in the field as evidence of an industrial ecosystem. Factories in the United States producing fuel, tankers delivering it across oceans, pipelines and convoys pushing it inland, clerks and quartermasters scheduling its flow. Each jerrycan was a link in a chain that, when followed backward, led to a scale of production and distribution Germany could not replicate in the short term. This disparity altered perception where it mattered most, among German officers and men. Witnesses later recounted the look on faces when they compared their own empty tanks with stacks of Allied fuel. Incredulity, shame, a dawning awareness that the problem was not merely tactical. That psychological moment is worth pausing over, because wars are not only decided by steel and speed, but by what commanders are willing to believe they can achieve. A commander who recognizes that his logistical base cannot support sustained offensive operations begins, often subconsciously, to compress his operational imagination. Plans once daring become constrained. Opportunities slip from reach. Those who oversaw the German defense felt the strain. Walter Model, a field marshal known for his insistence on holding ground, had to contend not only with the physical constraints of fuel and ammunition, but with the morale consequences of chronic resupply failures. Where model hoped for operational centers of gravity, points where reserves could be applied and the tide turned, the absence of fuel limited the timing and scope of those decisions. Albert Speer, responsible for keeping the machine supplied, struggled to substitute synthetic production and to adjust transportation priorities even as Allied interdiction intensified. It is important to avoid attributing a single causal arrow to any one element. The failure of the German Ardennes offensive, the famous Wacht am Rhein plan, cannot be reduced to a single deficiency. Weather, intelligence, readiness, command decisions, and sheer combat attrition all interacted with the logistical reality. What the Hansfeld scene makes plain, however, is how logistics could conspire with operational friction to turn tactical advantage into strategic impotence. As the Allies moved north and east from the Normandy lodgements, their supply system honed itself. Improvised solutions matured into robust networks. The Red Ball Express, originally established to keep the front supplied while port capacity was expanded, became a rolling demonstration of supply prioritization. Drivers worked long rotations. Routes were signed and maintained. Maintenance crews kept the old trucks moving.
Where German logistics had been built on a wartime economy deprived of external oil resources, the Allied system leveraged transatlantic shipping, continental pipeline construction, and an industrial apparatus that could replace burned-out materiel with startling rapidity. Yet logistics is not merely a matter of capacity, it is also a matter of doctrine and willingness. Faced with the prospect of German capture, American engineers and quartermasters sometimes chose to destroy supplies rather than surrender them. Those decisions would become a central moral and operational pivot in the Ardennes fighting. To the men in German uniform, watching Americans pour gasoline into the ground, then ignite it, the sight was both grotesque and humiliating, as if the enemy were willing to destroy treasure just to prove they could. Engineers recorded the act clinically. Commanders signed orders to deny resources that might prolong an enemy push. The calculus was cold but strategic. Better to burn millions of gallons than to let them refuel a renewed offensive that could cost thousands of lives and potentially breach the Allied supply network. The deliberate destruction of fuel caches posed a stark choice. For the Allies, burning fuel was a temporary loss, offset by a broader strategic reality: enough reserves, redundancies and supply lines, and the industrial horsepower to replace what was lost. For the Germans, the spectacle reinforced an inconvenient truth. The Allied logistics tale was deep and, when necessary, resolute. That psychological effect, seeing the enemy willing to turn abundance into ash, compounded the immediate material disadvantage. Field vignettes help make this abstract arithmetic concrete. Consider a single supply road during the Ardennes offensive, a narrow, wooded lane where a traffic jam had developed as trucks and tanks sought to advance under winter skies. One American infantry platoon, dug in at a farm, delays a German column for hours. The column consumes fuel as engines idle and crews attempt to restart stalled vehicles. By the time the Germans clear the choke point, darkness has fallen, air support is less effective, and the opportunity to exploit momentum has evaporated. Elsewhere, German units encounter abandoned armor, tanks left with hatches open, personal effects scattered, engines cold. Some abandonment stemmed from mechanical failure in brutal winter conditions. More often, it was lack of fuel. Photographs taken by Allied war correspondents show rows of silent tanks, their turrets turned as if to listen for orders that never came. At a captured depot near Hansfeld, American clerks had tucked a Stars and Stripes headline into a shipping crate by habit. It fluttered out during the scramble and landed on the snow like a small, mocking banner. Men noted the irony. Newspapers, logistics manifests, and fuel cans all told the same operational story.
An enemy fight for territory could be dramatic and violent, but if the means to keep vehicles rolling and aircraft flying were absent, those battles tended to collapse into attrition and retreat. This brings us back to the image that opens this story, the empty tiger beside the jerrycan pyramid. A lethal instrument up close, a museum piece later, the Tiger tank embodies the failure of a tactical icon to translate into strategic victory when the resource base is absent. But the museum image is not just melancholy, it is instructive. An empty gauge speaks louder than a broken gun. Tanks without fuel are immobile monuments. That immobility is the conceptual turning point of the Ardennes campaign and, more broadly, of late-war German operations.
Yet the story is not merely one of scarcity. It is a story of choices made under pressure. Allied engineers and commanders could have hoarded fuel for future offensives, avoided burning captured supplies, or centralized depots to protect against salvage. Instead, in specific instances, most notably near Stavelot and other depots, commanders chose to deny the enemy by fire. Documents from U.S. Army engineering units record the protocols used. Fuel drums and dump stocks were set alight in controlled burns when capture was imminent. The flaming reservoirs consumed fuel at rates that created black columns visible for miles. To German observers, these fires were both an operational setback and an existential message. The enemy's willingness to destroy surplus rather than see it reallocated was a display of logistical depth. This willingness must be understood within context. The Allies were not burning resources for spectacle. They were denying the enemy a critical force multiplier while accepting limited, calculated losses they could replace. In the calculus of late 1944, that calculus made sense. The United States industrial base could generate replacement fuel and material on a scale Germany could not match. But for the men on the ground who saw the flames and the canisters and the empty tanks, the act looked theatrical and punitive. As the morning of December 17th advances, the regimental commander at Hansfeld walks among his men, their faces drawn, their hands smelling faintly of gasoline. He knows how to maneuver tanks, to coordinate assaults, to read maps. What he does not know, what the men telling their stories realized only later, is that the theater of war had shifted from a struggle of local maneuver and firepower to a contest of supply chains and industrial endurance. He watches an American quartermaster sign a manifest and then light a torch to a stack of cans. The flames leap, black smoke rolling into the low-hanging clouds. For a moment, the whole scene has the surreal quality of a pyre. For the Germans nearby, it was a message no bullet could deliver. The Allies could afford to burn their treasure and still keep fighting. The consequences of that realization are immediate and far-reaching.
Operational plans that bargain on sustained mechanized thrusts hinge on one assumption above all: the availability of fuel at the right place and time. Remove that assumption, and even the best techniques, the fastest tanks, and the most daring pilots become blunt instruments. German commanders must now account for a strategic enemy who can reconfigure supply lines rapidly and is prepared to render captured resources useless. The practical fallout, immobilized armor, stalled offensives, lost momentum, follows inevitably. This is a moment of transition in the campaign's narrative. The visual of a burning depot is not merely dramatic, it is tactical evidence of a larger condition. But the Hansfeld capture and the depot burnings are not yet the whole story. Behind these scenes lies the anatomy of Allied logistics, the railheads, the pipelines, the scheduling officers, and the truck drivers who together made what the Germans saw at Hansfeld possible. That anatomy, with its redundancies and vulnerabilities, explains how it was feasible for Allied commanders to accept the deliberate loss of fuel in one place while continuing to press the advantage elsewhere. To understand how such a logistics system works, imagine a web. Ports on the Atlantic and Channel coasts as entry nodes, rail and pipeline arteries as trunk lines, depots and truck parks as distribution hubs. When a trunk line is cut, the web temporarily reorganizes. Alternate routes are prioritized, emergency stockpiles are tapped, and the maintenance crews swing into action. The Allies had spent months building such redundancy. The Red Ball Express, the Pluto pipelines, and the Shamrock network of rail and road links across liberated France were not single solves, but layers of capacity. That layered approach meant that no single captured depot or burned storage area could, in isolation, starve the front. It also meant that the Germans, facing a multiplicity of supply pathways and a steadily flowing stream of replacement material, could not rely on capturing a few dumps to turn the tide. At the same time, this system was expensive, visible, and vulnerable in its own ways. Truck convoys required fuel to carry fuel. Pipelines could be disrupted by sabotage or shelling. Ports could be congested or mined. The Allies had to protect their supply chain actively by patrolling routes, repairing bridges, and prioritizing targets that would keep the flow intact. The strategic advantage was not automatic. It was earned through constant labor, risk, and improvisation. Yet the combination of industrial production and adaptive logistics created an advantage that, in the aggregate, dwarfed localized German victories. As the day unfolds in Hansfeld and the Ardennes, small scenes crystallize into a larger pattern. A platoon of American engineers greases a pump and sends another convoy off. A German tank commander pries open a seam of canvas where a map is tucked, trying to find a supply node that no longer exists on any reliable schedule. Officers on both sides make decisions not primarily based on battlefield geometry, but on fuel vouchers and manifests. These mundane administrative details, stamps, schedules, and truck rosters, become the decisive instruments of war. The stage is set for the next, more painful revelations: how much fuel was destroyed at Stavelot and other depots, the precise tallies of daily deliveries into Allied armies, and the operational reports that recorded German units immobilized by empty tanks. Those details will show, in numbers and human consequences, the price of a logistical imbalance. The battle is not yet decided, but the arithmetic of supply is beginning to press on every commander's mind. The image of the empty fuel gauge on a once formidable tank haunts the scene like a moral. Machines are only as good as the resources that animate them. The next hours after Hansfeld make the lesson unmistakable. Reports pour in from nearby positions, depots set ablaze, columns stalled for lack of diesel, radio nets full of terse requests for fuel that cannot be answered. At Stavelot, one of the towns that would come to symbolize the Ardennes fighting, American engineers and supply officers carry out an ugly, deliberate duty. Faced with the real risk that enormous stocks of fuel would fall intact into German hands, commanders authorize controlled destruction. Drums are opened, wicks are set, and the stored petroleum that once promised to turn the front line into a rolling machine of steel becomes a towering black inferno. These burnings were not random acts of waste. Military protocol dictated denial. When capture was imminent and evacuation impossible, engineers burned stocks to prevent their use by the enemy. For the soldiers who watched the flames, it looked like an admission of vulnerability. For commanders, it was a constrained, painful calculation. The critical point is this: the Allies could, occasionally and deliberately, accept the loss of stores because the broader system could shoulder that loss. Germany could not. Contemporary records and later logistics studies illustrate the scale of the imbalance without pretending absolute precision. In the autumn and winter of 1944, Allied armies in northwestern Europe were consuming fuel at rates historians typically place between several 100,000 and, at times, over 1 million gallons per day for the whole theater, depending on the intensity of operations and the number of corps engaged. Those flows arrived through layered systems: merchant fleets unloading at expanded ports, trains and trucks moving the tonnage inland, pipeline spurs and temporary storage at forward dumps. Pluto and subsequent inland pipelines converted a fraction of that flow into a continuous, if vulnerable, stream.
By contrast, German frontline units in the Ardennes were operating on allotments that amounted to days of endurance, not weeks. Speer's post-war accounts and Allied interrogations of German staff officers converge on the same theme. German priorities and capacity were eroding, and the shortfall in liquid fuel was now a structural constraint. What the Germans encountered at Hansfeld and elsewhere was not merely more fuel on the table, but the visible expression of an industrial relationship: production, transatlantic transport, and distribution that acted as a single instrument. Behind each jerry can was a chain: American refineries and storage terminals, Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic, tank farms in England and France, pipelines and rail spurs feeding motor pools. The Allies had learned to think in throughput. How many gallons per day could be turned into operational miles for tanks and sorties for aircraft? Numeric scales matter because they shape decisions. Where German commanders had to weigh a single tank's fuel against the needs of an entire corps, Allied commanders routinely planned using thousands of gallon increments. That difference of scale changed the calculus of war. In the field, small frictions multiplied. Narrow Ardennes roads became places where time turned into fuel consumption. Engines idling in long columns ate diesel. Crews working in freezing weather spent precious gasoline on generators for radio sets and heaters. A single ambush or even a stubbornly held farmhouse could delay an entire brigade long enough to consume reserves intended for an offensive push. One recorded vignette captures this. A German armored column, delayed by hours on a clogged lane, found it to lead tanks idling and its fuel allocations dwindling as the column stretched and stalled. By nightfall, with supplies dwindling and commanders unable to guarantee refueling points, the same units that had proclaimed to spearhead a breakthrough were reduced to patchwork withdrawals and desperate searches for fuel. These micro-moments accumulate into operational failure. Consider the abandonment of armor.
Photographs from the Ardennes show rows of heavy tanks left in open ground, hatches up, personal effects scattered nearby, engines cold, turrets idle. Some of these losses stem from mechanical breakdowns and the brutal winter. Many, however, are direct products of fuel shortage. A tank loss due to lack of fuel is a particularly brutal arithmetic, a complex, costly system rendered inert by a missing commodity. For commanders, the sight is demoralizing in a way that casualty figures alone do not convey. A force unable to move is a force whose potential is extinguished before it can be applied. The Luftwaffe's inability to resolve the supply imbalance deserves attention here.
The title's cinematic contrast, 300-mile-per-hour German fighters versus flying furniture, points to a bitter irony. Speed and tactical prowess in the air could not substitute for a secure, domestic fuel base. The Luftwaffe still had capable fighters and skilled pilots, but the air arm was suffering from attrition in aircraft, fuel, and trained crews. Moreover, Allied air power and control of key airfields meant that, on clear days, Allied fighters could contest supply routes and protect convoys. On the grim days of Ardennes weather, the fog limited air action, but it also limited any decisive use of air attack to sever the Allies' entire logistical chain. Bomber sorties and fighter interdiction can damage depots and convoys, but they cannot, in the long run, dismantle an industrialized supply network when that network is supported by secure ports, replacement capacity, and a willingness to accept losses in particular nodes. In short, one cannot airstrike a pipeline into non-existence overnight. You can delay a convoy, but you cannot instantly erase an entire nation's capacity to generate and move fuel. The metaphor of flying furniture sharpens when one considers what Allied transport actually did in this period. Transport aircraft and gliders had strategic roles earlier in the war that were tightly choreographed. By late 1944, air transport complemented sea, rail, and road movements by providing point-to-point replenishment and reinforcing isolated pockets. The image, Allied airlift and transport moving crates and parcels across the front, may sound almost domestic, hence the phrase's dark humor. But that furniture was the daily accoutrement of mobilization: spare parts, radios, ammunition, and occasionally fuel in drums or bladders. The capacity to put payload on wings and move it where needed multiplied the Allies' options and made localized interdiction less decisive. Back in the Ardennes, correspondence and after-action reports record the precise cruelty of decisions made under these constraints. Quartermasters and engineering officers kept procedural notes on how to deny, how to destroy, and how to calculate the acceptable loss. One engineering after-action summary, a primary source practice note rather than a narrative source, details methods used to render drums unrecoverable: seals broken, fuel spiked with agents to contaminate engines, and stockpiles ignited in controlled burns. The black columns that rose from these burns were visible signs to the German soldiers of a willingness to impose short-term damage to deny a strategic advantage to the enemy. It was a stark form of economic warfare writ small and immediate. Testimony from soldiers on both sides captures the human face of these calculations. An anonymous German non-commissioned officer later described, in post-war recollection recorded in an oral history, the mixture of fury and disbelief when American forces torched fuel dumps. He spoke not of arithmetic, but of a moral image. They set their treasure on fire. We could do nothing. It was like they were telling us the war would go on without them. Likewise, a U.S. engineer's memoir later recorded the grim professionalism with which men poured fuel into pits and then backed away to ensure ignition, an act carried out with a kind of mechanical resolve. Such testimonies are invaluable, but the historian's task is to place them alongside the systemic facts. The soldiers' emotions matter because they reveal how material conditions reshape morale and decision-making. Seeing a depot burn is not the same thing as calculating daily throughput figures, but it changes what commanders believe is possible. Once officers concede, even tacitly, that fuel is not reliably available, their operational imagination narrows. Maneuvers that require sustained fuel deliveries are no longer credible options. The timetable for action stretches or collapses accordingly. The immediate operational fallout in the Ardennes is difficult to reduce to a single number, but the pattern is clear. German units that had hoped to exploit rapid mobility found themselves fighting on the defensive,
patching together local resupplies, and improvising with captured materiel when possible. Even where fuel was captured intact, the Germans often lacked the logistical frameworks, pumps, compatible fittings, distribution networks, to immediately convert that capture into maneuverable gains. A capture depot is not a turnkey filling station. It is a node that must be integrated into a wider distribution plan that the Germans did not have the time or resources to build in the depths of winter and under Allied pressure. This mismatch surfaces again when considering the psychological effects on commanders. Walter Model's reputation as a tenacious defensive commander implies a capacity to extract fighting value from scarce resources, but even Model's defensive doctrine could not fully compensate for structural shortages. When the supply base tells you that reserves are exhausted, even aggressive commanders find their strategic options constrained. Spear's accounts and corroborating Allied intelligence reports underscore how the depletion of fuel not only limited operations, but also fed a narrative of impending collapse among German leadership. From the Allied perspective, the willingness to destroy fuel rather than let it fall into enemy hands was part of a broader operational doctrine that embraced damage mitigation through control of the larger system. Port prioritization, the construction of temporary storage and pipeline networks, the dedication of entire truck parks like the Red Ball Express to continuous flow, each element was aimed at maintaining operational tempo.
The Red Ball Express itself, improvised though it was, exemplified an organizational bent toward movement. Routes designated for continuous back and forth, maintenance crews on call, and a logistic culture that prized keeping vehicles moving above short-term material preservation. In effect, Allied logistics converted industrial output into the currency of movement. The final weeks of the Ardennes campaign make visible the strategic lesson that Hansfeld hinted at. German offenses, brilliant in conception or audacious in execution, were increasingly vulnerable to a simple arithmetic. Without steady petroleum, steel and speed are inert. As the offensive failed to secure decisive breakthroughs, the Germans retreated not merely from ground, but from the possibility of sustained mechanized warfare. A battered force might still fight, but it did so under a different logic, one of scavenging and short bursts rather than measured, reinforced thrusts. The visual counterpoint between the empty tiger and the jerry-can pyramid remains compelling because it distills that transformation into a single frame. The tiger is a machine built for shock and fire. Its power was real, but its agency on the battlefield depended on being fueled, maintained, and integrated into a system that could sustain it. Where that system collapsed, the tiger became a relic, a dangerous, heavy statue whose threat evaporated with its fuel. That image offers a broader lesson about modern war. Raw military technology by itself is insufficient. What translates capacity into effect is the logistical architecture that undergirds it, the roads, pumps, clerks, and drivers that move necessities forward. There are other, subtler consequences to this lesson. The Allies' industrial supremacy tended to shape strategic choices beyond simply what they burned or how many trucks they deployed. It changed how they planned operations, prioritized targets for strategic bombing, and allocated scarce repair and maintenance resources. The decision to target German synthetic fuel plants in 1944 was not merely punitive, it was a strategy aimed to cut the sinews of mechanized warfare. By undermining the production base, strategic bombing and interdiction amplified the immediate field-level shortages that made the likes of Hansfeld possible. In other words, policy at the national and theater level cascaded down into logistical reality at the company and tank level. That cascade is part of why the Ardennes matters as a case study. It shows war as a multi-layered organism in which strategic choices, industrial capacity, and frontline improvisation all interact. Tactical daring can win a battle, but to convert tactical victories into strategic gains requires a foundation of supplies. The Germans in December 1944 were running an expeditionary-style offensive with insufficient logistical reach. The Allies, for their part, had converted industrial might into operational sustainment.
When those two realities collided at Hansfeld, the symbolism was blunt. Abundance walked among the abandoned and the empty, and the scene read like a verdict. In closing, the episode crystallizes a central thesis. In industrial age warfare, victory increasingly depends on the ability to generate, protect, and distribute the material flows that make movement possible. Fighters that can reach 300 miles per hour and tanks that can punch through defensive lines are formidable tools. But they are instruments, not autocrats.
Their authority on the battlefield is granted by a supply chain that keeps them fed. The Allies' logistics system, trucks rolling night and day, pipelines feeding forward, engineers willing to sacrifice stores to deny the enemy, gave them a strategic depth Germany could no longer match. The empty fuel gauge on a museum Tiger is therefore more than a melancholic artifact. It is a teaching device. It asks viewers to look past the romantic image of the invincible machine and to see the quiet, relentless work that allows machines to matter. It reminds us that wars are won not only by weapons and bravery, but by the mundane, often invisible labor of logistics, loading docks, map rooms, maintenance bays, and drivers who return again and again to deliver the next load. If this narrative changes how you picture the Ardennes and the late war period, there are more lessons to pull from the intersection of industry and tactics. For those who want to dig deeper into the numbers behind the flows, the estimates of daily consumption, the capacities of pipelines like Pluto, and the truck counts that powered the Red Ball Express, follow up with archival analyses and logistics studies that lay those figures out with primary source backing. History here is arithmetic and human story woven together. One informs the other. Like the men who watched that jerry can pyramid burn and understood in their bones that a new kind of warfare had arrived, we can learn from both the spectacle and the ledger. The Allies' capacity to move fuel, men, and materiel was, in effect, a kind of flying furniture, transport power that, when applied at scale, made tactical assets like tanks and fighters contingent on a logistics reality the Germans could not overturn. That is the heart of the paradox at Hansfeld. A mountain of cans and an empty gauge together tell a story about industrial supremacy and the limits of battlefield heroics. If this episode resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the mechanics behind history's pivotal moments, and consider watching our next piece on how logistics shaped outcomes across the Second World War.